Let's break down the schematic changes we can expect from the Cincinnati Bengals in 2024, as they've got some clear personnel changes that may drive a few subtle changes on both sides of the ball.
You are Locked On Bengals, your daily Cincinnati Bengals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, Bengals fans, and welcome to another episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. We're a day away from mini camp here as we record a schematic preview to the 2024 season. I'm your host, Jake Liscow, joined today by Mike Santagata, a frequent guest of this show, and you can find him on It's Always Game Day in Cincinnati and writing for the Bengals on SI.com with James Rapine, the normal co-host of this show. If you're new to the show, you can subscribe and find us on YouTube and everywhere you get your podcast. Become an everydayer or make us your first listen, or both, as so many of you do already. And shout out to all of you who have Locked On Bengals as part of your daily habits. And Mike, it's been a while, but with the changes the Bengals have made to personnel and some of the hints we're getting through the early part of the offseason program, just in combination with what we observed from the team last year in training camp and late in the season last year, we have some ideas of some things that might look a little bit different for this team in 2024 compared to 2023. And one thing that has constantly changed for this team is the running game. I would say is the most frequently changed element of this team's offense. And now, with a running back by committee approach, where we're seeing in the clips we're seeing coming out of the OTA program anyway, a relatively even split between Chase Brown and Zach Moss going with the quote unquote first team, we could see a significant change once again here, where there will no longer be a bell cow type back that they've had in Joe Mixon. And instead we see a running back by committee. Do you think that leads to changes in the way these guys are deployed, or changes the way they roll the running game out?
I think it's interesting that you maybe could see Chase Brown in a little bit more of a fleshed out role, where we talked a lot last season. It feels ages ago, but he kind of got like the designer runs. He got like GY counter and some stuff where it's like, you're hitting this hole, just wait for it to open up, and things he was comfortable doing from college. Maybe now with another full year under his belt in the offseason, they can trust him a little bit more to run duo, which is a running back's run. You got to make the Mike linebacker wrong. He's not blocked until at the end of the play when you're supposed to make him wrong. You press into the hole, keep him in the A gap, or is he going to get outside because you press outside and you can sneak back inside? Joe Mixon was good at that. And Zach Moss looks to be pretty good at it himself, but can Chase Brown take some of those snaps? Because that's how he's going to get on the field more. So if he's seeing a 50% workload, I would assume he can run duo. He can run tight zone, inside zone, and some of the stuff that requires more patience, not as exciting and sexy because you are capped at, 5 yards at times, where even if it's blocked up pretty good, you might just be getting 5 yards because they got safeties coming downhill. They've got, how good is good blocked up for the Bengals offensive line with 5 guys blocking and maybe not a real tight end on the field. You get 5 guys on the field. They can only block the 5 guys that are in front of them. So I would like to see Chase Brown in that role more. Maybe he can make a guy or two miss and turn those into explosive plays, break the ceiling of some of those inside zone duo runs. And while still getting a lot of those designer runs, in my brain, I still think Zach Moss is probably going to take a lot of those like poundings, the inside, like I'm talking about the tight zone, the duo. I think that's going to be a lot of Zach Moss's work. He did a lot of inside zone with the Colts, with their RPO system. So we'll see, but I don't know how much the running game schematically will change, but I think we could see a different deployment of Chase Brown.
When you think about the different jobs the Bengals ask their running backs to do, you talked about a few of them there, in the running game in particular, in terms of the shotgun run game and the inside zone and duo stuff the Bengals like to do out of the shotgun, and some of the more, wind back, counter stuff that you're talking about with Chase Brown, the quote unquote designer runs where you're not forced to do as much as a running back. And we talked about last year why that allows Chase Brown to potentially play a little bit faster. I think seeing how his role evolves will be interesting. But the other big role for a Bengals back, before we talk about whether we expect him to get under center a little bit more this year, is in pass protection and the ability to contribute in the receiving game. And perhaps Joe Mixon's biggest contribution to this team in the last couple of years is as a receiving back, although his pass blocking left something to be desired. And they had Samaje Perine for that role prior to his departure for Denver. And last year kind of cobbled it together and used a variety of guys in that role, including Drew Sample. Do you think that one of these guys is a better fit for the passing down role? Is one of them more equipped as a pass protector? Because I think ideally Chase Brown would be the receiving back just because his speed plays up as a receiver in my mind. But do either of these guys have the skill set to be the every down passing back as opposed to the receiving back versus the pass blocking back? And are they going to be turning to Drew Sample again in that role?
Almost similar in my mind, where I would project, at least at the start of the season, that Zach Moss is probably the guy that can pass protect a little bit more cleanly, a little bit more consistently, where Chase Brown, even in college, had his warts with pass protection. And it kind of carried over to the NFL. Now, I do think Chase Brown should get designer stuff in the passing game too. Screens. We saw how great he was on screen passes, and that can come on first and second down. But maybe you get into that third and long, it might still be Drew Sample, because what do you need a running back on the field for? If you're in 3rd and 13 situation, you need to just push that ball down the field. And he's probably the best blocker of the guys that we have talked about. But 3rd and 4, 3rd and 3, you're thinking of throwing the ball, but you don't want to basically go empty, no chance of running this ball. If they line up with 4 down linemen and maybe 1 linebacker, heck, we'll hand it off. And worst comes to worst, get to 4th and inches, we'll just run it again. So I think Zach Moss is a guy that cannot tip your hand so much, whereas Joe Mixon either tipped your hand or he could be abused a little bit as a pass blocker, seeing like the Vikings game where he kind of got played off the field a little bit from their blitzes. In those 3rd and short, maybe even 2nd and medium situations. I think when you get into those situations, Zach Moss should provide you with some consistency. And I think he can catch the ball okay. Like, I think what you would see is a little bit of a drop-off in terms of receiving for Zach Moss from Joe Mixon, but an increase in pass protection. I think he'll be more consistent. He's got better eyes. He knows how to get into the right place and read things out a little bit better. So it makes you a little bit more dynamic and unpredictable in that situation, rather than Joe Mixon's on the field, we're going to run a cross dog if he steps in there no matter what. See the Saints game too, same thing happened.
So you get a little bit more 3rd and medium to 3rd and short versatility with Zach Moss, hypothetically, if it plays out the way we're expecting to there. The last run game related topic in my mind, outside of like trying to find a 3rd back to contribute in that role, because I don't know if that guy is on the team right now, although I also don't know that they're making other moves to bolster the running back room at this point. Do you think they go under center a little bit more this year? And we can talk about play action stuff in the next segment, but is the precursor to that getting under center a little bit more in the running game as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's what they've wanted to do. I think what you're going to see, and we'll talk more about this too coming up, is just this offense should be, knocking on wood, if nothing bad happens, the offense that was promised last season. This never came to fruition because of the Joe Burrow injury. And then it kind of started to hit together around, the 49ers game, but then kind of fell apart when you get to the Texans game. But game to game, things just happen. I think this should be the offense that was promised. It doesn't mean a balanced 50-50 run pass split or anything and going under center 80% of the time, because Joe Burrow's best ability is his brain and being in shotgun, being able to read things out cleaner and spread out there, just like Peyton Manning used to do. But just like Peyton Manning used to do, gotta get under center and hand that ball off sometimes. Keep it easy on yourself. Kind of take the brain out of some plays. Give yourself a break and a rest to be able to just hand this off. Maybe you just have a counting number where you're just going to kill it to the weak side, whichever side they've got less defenders are running, and it's just inside zone, under center. Great. I think under center also just, it gives you better angles for the run game where your running back's going to line up better with the offensive line for those plays. And I think it's also makes you a little bit, once again, less predictable, where a lot of coaches have talked about this, where you've only got so many runs to the same side as the running back. You got a lot of runs that go away from them. Hand it off, and you're always going to be able to run zone across the body. same side zone hasn't worked that well at the NFL level. At least a lot of teams don't do it. So I would predict that they're going to go under center more just because it gives you a little boost to the run game. And then you can add in some of that play action and deep shots and over routes, everything else that's, meta in the NFL off of it.
Yeah. Let's stay on that topic and talk about the play action game and changes to the passing game, and stay on the topic of the offense, as we do very frequently with this team that runs through Joe Burrow. This episode of Locked On Bengals is sponsored by FanDuel Sportsbook, and it's summertime, and FanDuel knows what's going on this summer. It's Major League Baseball, with the Reds on a winning streak over the weekend, dealing with the Rockies and the Cubs, and the NBA Finals going on. And if you're a hockey fan, well, you got the NHL Stanley Cup to bet on as well, and you can get into all of that and more over on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And right now they're offering you $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. You bet $5 on the Celtics to win a game, well, you get $200 in bonus bets, which you can use on finals MVP, home run props, or the Bengals 9.5-point favorite line in week 1 against the New England Patriots, the biggest favorites in the NFL that week. Again, $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet over at FanDuel.com/lockedon, where you can check it all out and get started, whatever your flavor of sports betting is. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. Mike, let's talk about this passing offense. You mentioned the offense that was promised. What we expected last year was a lot more play action based on what we saw in training camp, based on what we saw in the offseason program, what we were talking about at this point last year. We're expecting more under center play action. We saw it late last year with Jake Browning. We saw it a little bit with Joe Burrow before Jake Browning took over. They were unable to get to this stuff early in the year. So whether or not it's a change schematically depends on your definition of a change. It might be a change from what they put on the field last year, but not a change necessarily from what they installed or what they planned to do last year. I'll add the caveat of, as I've mentioned on this show, probably more than I ought to, the addition of Justin Riscotti from Minnesota and the way that those principles will be incorporated into the offense is something that is a question for me when you talk about, getting the stuff that is quote unquote meta, the stuff that is popular, the prevailing strategies in the passing game in the NFL used a little bit more. The over routes, for example. I wonder if those principles come along, and those are the differences we see in the Bengals under center game this year. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Minnesota loves an over route. That's what they put Justin Jefferson over routes all the time. You got to have to be able to protect it. You got to have the play action to kind of take in that second level, create more space for them to be able to work one-on-one or try to mess with the communication to pass that off. And maybe you can get a linebacker on a Jamar Chase. You get in that situation. Would love to be in that situation. But I do think they were trying to get to this stuff last year. Maybe not as much PA play action over route stuff as they might hit this season. I think if you are going to look at the Justin Riscotti edition and try to think a little bit about how Minnesota concepts can be incorporated into what the Bengals are doing, but I think Kevin O'Connell, even though they both come from Sean McVay, I feel like these are different offenses, and even Sean McVay is a different offense from when he had either of them as assistants. What O'Connell and McVay have always had in common is, running the heck out of some over routes. So I think that is something that the Bengals might want to add a little bit more into the repertoire. And that's probably a little bit, we'll discuss it. Could they get to that a little bit more when you have a guy that's no longer slot only as your third wide receiver? Because you typically want to run those from reduced splits. You don't want to be running over routes from outside the numbers because, well, that's going to take a while to get to where you need them to be. So I think that could also be, it's not a blessing because I do think, the guy who was here, Tyler Boyd, was a pretty solid player, but, a little bit of like might not have like that solid, consistent slot receiver, but do we need it? Jamar Chase into the slot. And I know that's a lot of people have talked about, it's got more opportunities to happen now than I think it did last season before, just because of the personnel that they currently employ.
Well, and if you get guys just running away from leverage on some of those too, you think about Jermaine Burton and even Charlie Jones in those roles, where they've both been working in the slot in the offseason program in the absence of T. Higgins and Jamar Chase. Those guys have more speed, more athletic ability than Tyler Boyd did. So what I've talked about, thinking about, the wide receiver 3 conversation, the slot receiver conversation, and replacing Tyler Boyd's slot productivity, where he was really good, is doing all of the technical things that you need your slot receiver to do. The option routes he was generally very good at, although we've highlighted in the past a few significant exceptions to that point. He's generally a guy that was on the same page with Joe Burrow and a reliable guy underneath, and a guy that Burrow was very comfortable throwing the ball to on third downs, regardless of where he was going, because he was able to run those routes at a high level and technically do what he was supposed to do within the confines of a play. And I think Tyler Boyd can still do those things, but he's not a Bengal anymore. And so when you have this transition to more athletic, faster slot receivers who are less experienced than Tyler Boyd, maybe that leads to a different way of deploying those guys. And part of that is also going to be, as you mentioned, Jamar Chase into the slot a little bit more, and guys like Mike Gesicki and perhaps Tanner Hudson as well, getting into the slot a little bit more and kind of playing the wide receiver 3 role in some 12 personnel looks, where the Bengals might have Drew Sample on the field aligned in line and one of those tight ends in the slot. So the combination of different players that I think we'll see from a personnel perspective as wide receiver 3 should precipitate some different usages of how the Bengals are asking that slot receiver to win and contribute to the offense. And I guess I shouldn't say wide receiver 3 as much as I should really focus on the slot here, although I do think it is also wide receiver 3 by committee. But the changes to the type of player that will be in the slot may unlock some different avenues for attacking for this offense specifically.
Yeah, I mean, heck, you didn't mention him. You can see Trent Irwin out there week 1 and Jamar Chase full-time slot. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility, and they just have Trent Irwin on the outside because he's always been a solid outside receiver. The issue is when you try to put him into the slot. So maybe they just transition Jamar Chase more and more to the slot, and week 1, it's not 100%. I'm not saying it's going to be wide receiver 3 is 100% Trent Irwin, but maybe the first drive, you've got Trent Irwin out there and Jamar Chase takes 80% of his snaps from the slot, something like that. That's always a possibility. Jermaine Burton and Charlie Jones, more ability to get in the slot. Yossi Voss would be the sexier version of the Trent Irwin in the slot. Or Trent Irwin on the outside. So if Yossi Voss is out there, if you like that name more, he's out there week 1 for the first drive, and Jamar Chase is slot only, and they're just trying to pick on a team. You mentioned the 12 personnel. I would always at least send the 12 personnel out and see if a defensive coordinator is, foolish enough to match Mike Gesicki with a linebacker, or do you match that with base? Some teams might just brain in neutral. Oh, that's 12 personnel. That's 2 tight ends. We're going to match that with base instead of what I think most defensive coordinators will probably do is match that with nickel, because they don't treat Mike Gesicki like he's a real tight end, even if he'll line up in line. So yeah, I think the committee idea, we'll see if it truly manifests or if they're going to, work just Jermaine Burton because you'll have inside-outside versatility or something. Or they just really like one of these guys. They really take a step forward and snag that role. But I feel like it could add some dynamicism to this offense and some differences to this offense, because everybody we've talked about are very different players. You think of what Jermaine Burton does well, what Charlie Jones does well, what Yossi Voss and Trent Irwin and Mike Gesicki, Tanner Hudson, all these guys, what do they do well? And it's not what Tyler Boyd does well. And that's not a slight against Boyd. Boyd did some stuff very well, like we talked about, the option routes, being reliable, levels concepts. But what he wasn't doing, running away from corners, going over the top on a seam route and catching the high pointing the ball, dunking on guys. These aren't things that Boyd was particularly great at. He's done it, but yeah, when I think about it, it's like there's a lot of difference. The differences in the passing offense will come, one, from that play action we talked about that they've wanted to implement for the past 2 seasons, but it also comes from just having different guys that will be on the field.
Do you think that the closest analog to Tyler Boyd from a skill set perspective still on the team might be Tanner Hudson? Because that's the one I keep coming back to.
Yeah, it's interesting because he did run a lot of choice routes, and he was pretty good at them. So yeah, that might be it. Because Charlie Jones didn't step onto the field as like the slot receiver everybody might have been thinking he could have been coming out of college.
Right.
He was more comfortable outside, and it might be. Yeah, it's like one of those sounds crazy, but
I do think that outside of that, just the vertical potential from these guys, it makes 989 a much more exciting play. Like you actually consider the post a lot more with the personnel that will be running the post this year on 989, the 2 outside goes and the inside post or crosser, with some of the additional speed and explosion they'll have in the slot this year. Coming up next, let's discuss the defensive side of scheme changes, and we'll be focused, of course, on replacing DJ Reader. You talk about running back by committee. You talk about wide receiver 3 by committee. What about DJ Reader by committee? Let's discuss coming up next. Let's talk defense, Mike. And I think where the focus is, or perhaps ought to be, is how do the Bengals replace the ability and style of play they got from DJ Reader? And one thing we've talked about a lot is, do they have a guy that they feel comfortable asking to 1.5 gap, 2 gap, or do they become more of a 1 gap, get up field kind of front? We've seen the Bengals exploit those 1 gap, get up field kind of front. So I wonder how comfortable they are going to that idea on defense, knowing how much success they've had against it. See last year's game against San Francisco, for example, as one of these, or which, what was the other big game where they ran the ball really well against a penetrating defense? Was it Indy? Do you
Indy
recall?
definitely was one of those.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna just find. I was gonna find it for you if you kept talking.
I can't remember the other one. I was hoping you would recall off the top, but either way, it's a kind of defense stylistically they've had a lot of success against. I think it was the Colts. That looks like their other best running game of the year. Looking at a quick glance here. Isn't that Gus Bradley?
Yeah, I mean, that was the big deal. It's got Gus Bradley, and I think Rod Marinelli might have followed him there, who is like the king of, feet first, penetrate upfield, stop the run on the way to the quarterback.
They had 30 runs in that game. 29 of them were running back designed runs. The yard per carry number wasn't amazing, but considering they had 30 runs in that game, safe to call it a successful game. But the 49ers game, certainly a bigger example of that. So I wonder, given Zach Taylor's experience playing against defenses like that, how comfortable the Bengals would be going to that approach on their own defensively, where they were kind of forced to do it late last year. But do any of their additions make you think that that isn't the direction they would go with their defensive front?
The way I think you build the idea that they're still going to try to have a nose tackle 2 gap is, I think, with taking McKinley Jackson in the top 100, and even though in college he wasn't particularly great at 2 gapping, and he wasn't really asked to do it a ton, he was more of a 1 gap slant defense at Texas A&M. But maybe you just think like we needed that body type because that is crucial to playing defense, to playing this defense. But they also they let Josh Tupou go, and he was really DJ Reader's backup, so they don't have a second body type like that on the team. So kind of get to, I don't think that they think they'll be able to replace DJ Reader like that. I think they see how this is going, and they may have to move to some type of defense, which you could say is a good thing or a concerning thing, where they're going to have 1 gap across the board, fly upfield, maybe some slant stuff that they haven't done a ton of in the past. It'll be interesting because I do think it'll be a change. I think the way you build the idea that it's going to be the same is just if you really ride the McKinley Jackson is a nose tackle and he can take DJ Reader's workload, or maybe even think Chris Jenkins, because Michigan did 1.5 gap and play slow. So maybe you think Chris Jenkins, we'll just 2 gap BJ Hill and Chris Jenkins, and or at least 1.5, the entire front type of situation, still can ball fit the linebackers. Because I think that's part of it too. Where if you get to the 1 gap defense, those linebackers are going to start going downhill, taking on blocks a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting because they have They do that, but they haven't been asked to mainly do that.
Yeah, is that something that brings a level of play up for the linebacker? Something we talked about last week when we went through the biggest questions for the defense this year is, do the surroundings and hopefully surrounding improvements on this defense help the linebackers to play more like they did the last time they were good 2 years ago, unlike last year where there were still flashes, of course, of good linebacker play, but they weren't as consistent and there were more mental lapses there. And part of that is in the run game up front and not having to do too much and not trying to do too many things and thinking about too many different jobs all at the same time because you're trying to cover for teammates that you don't trust to do their job. And a lot of that to do with their surroundings. But you would hope that the additions that they've made allow them to somehow figure out a sustainable approach up front. Because when you talk about slanting and one gapping everything on this defense, it does give me a little bit of pause. It makes me more concerned than not with a continuing issue on this defense in the run game in particular. Although I do think that like BJ Hill, Sheldon Rankins, and Chris Jenkins can all be decent run defenders.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, can they all be consistent and decent run defenders or good run defenders without a good nose tackle as part of the mix to go with them?
And, well, you might not think Sheldon Rankins, whatever you think of Sheldon Rankins last season. I mean, it's not like Houston had a high-end nose tackle. Like most of the snaps came where Sheldon Rankins was either playing nose tackle or his nose tackle was Malik Collins. It was less of a nose tackle than Sheldon Rankins is.
Yeah.
So he kind of did it last year. We'll see. In the Texans, I think would be the example if the Bengals wanted to look at a game where a penetrating defense really gave them fits. It was the Texans game.
Yeah.
And maybe you just think, like, if we get that type of pressure, if you can remember that Texans game and the amount of pressure they got and just dominating the Bengals front five, get that type of pressure, it doesn't matter. Like, they're not going to be running the ball because we'll be up 10 points. And then they got to throw the ball against this front. And now it is an improved pass rush. So I think that is also where you can build a plan. I do have concern, though, about like the idea of they're just going to one gap everything. It also means maybe you're bringing a safety down into the box.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's why you signed Von Bell. Maybe that's where you think Jordan Battle does his best work. And Geno Stone is now playing post safety, sideline to sideline as the only guy back there. Does that help? I mean, they were giving up an excruciating amount of explosive plays, even trying to play too high last year. So maybe they think, we got a guy back there like Geno Stone. We got him on a steal. We think he's one of the guys that can actually be a post safety, go sideline to sideline, read things out, and make plays. And that means that we can bring a safety down to basically always be +1 in the box. Maybe that's where they want to go. And I don't think that's been discussed as much, but that usually goes hand in hand with trying to one gap.
And if they do iron out some of the communication issues in the secondary, maybe that makes that a smoother transition, or maybe that leads to some big dime looks at times, although I don't know how that helps you in run defense. I'm just trying to figure out ways for Dax Hill to get on the field or for Jordan Battle to get on the field, and I'm probably scrapping for something that isn't there. But if the corners can play at a higher level, in particular the one that is not Cam Taylor-Britt, who is generally pretty solid last year, if they can get more across the field from him and continue to get Mike Hilton to play the way he played in the last 10 or so games of the season, well, then you probably are feeling better about your defense in general. I'm still worried about slot fades a lot, something that plagued this team last year. If they go to this single high safety, one gapping run defense style of defense a little bit more. But on the other hand, if they're getting good pressure, especially up the middle with Sheldon Rankins, if Chris Jenkins can transition to be a really nice pass rusher late in year one, perhaps, or if BJ Hill and Rankins together can play a little bit more penetrating style football, well, then maybe all that goes together. Miles Murphy taking the step, the healthy Sam Hubbard, like those personnel factors could enable that schematic change we're discussing, where it's something that I'm still eager to see. Like, what are they doing in the preseason? Because I think that even though the preseason is very vanilla and whatever, the way that they're playing from a schematic approach in terms of what they're asking their defensive front to do in run fits and in what approach they're taking there should tell us the direction they're going for the regular season as well, even though we won't necessarily see all the players doing it that we'll expect to see doing it in the regular season. Mike, appreciate the time. You can find him on Twitter at Bengals_Sands. You can find his podcast, It's Always Game Day in Cincinnati, wherever you get your podcast. And We'll be back for some training camp coverage for you, not training camp, mini camp coverage for you this week. And James will be back, of course, for the next couple of episodes of mini camp coverage as well here on Locked On Bengals. Until then, thanks for listening to this episode of the Locked On Bengals podcast. Hoo day, and have a good one.